3, 2, 1.
All right. I think we are live now. Let me check.
It says live.
Yeah.
En vivo.
There,
En vivo y en directo.
I see it now. So I have it on my phone too, just so I can follow along with the chat, the comments. So everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to our first Facebook Live, Facebook Cafecito with Latinx Said. We're going to get started now. I'm very excited. It's my first time hosting, and we have an awesome guest joining us today. So, as you might know, this is our first of 6 cafecitos that we'll be hosting this semester, all the way through April. So if you haven't gotten that information, we'll be sure to post it as well, so you can register, you can keep up with all the Facebook Live events we have going on this semester. So yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. I'll introduce myself, and then our guests can also do that. My name is José Cisneros. I work at Latinx Said as a Somos Carolina Program Manager. I was born in Mexico and grew up in the US in rural eastern North Carolina, a very small town called Snow Hill. Shout out to Greene County and all the people out there that are still, putting in the work. I went to UNC, graduated high school, went to UNC. I actually majored in history, so I'm very excited to be talking about this topic today. I would like to learn, more about it, of course, explore it, reflect on our experiences as a Latinx community here in the state of North Carolina. So after UNC, I went to graduate school at the University of Notre Dame. I studied education, got a master's, did a teaching fellowship. I was a social studies and Spanish teacher in Dallas, Texas for 3 years. And then I came back in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic to be here back in my home state. I moved to Durham, and now I'm working at Latinx Ed. And so I'm really excited to be doing this, as well with like our involvement at UNC and in the communities that we work with Somos Carolina, Lee County, and Orange County. So yeah, that's just a little bit about myself. We'll be talking about some of these topics more as we go. Now I'm gonna turn it over to you, Paul.
Okay, so hello, everybody. I'm Paul Cuadros. I'm a professor in the Hussman School of Journalism and Media at UNC Chapel Hill. And I'm also an author. I'm also a television star for
Really?
yeah, crazy. What else? I was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan. My parents originally are from Peru. They immigrated to the United States in 1960. And my father came here first, and then he worked in Ann Arbor for about a year, almost 2 years, washing dishes, doing whatever, pushing a broom, and then was able to bring my mother and my 2 brothers. And then once the family was reunited, I was born, the first American in the family. And I grew up in Ann Arbor. I went to the University of Michigan. I was graduated from there. Let's see, what did I do after that? I became a copywriter in advertising. For about 5 years, I did that, and then I went back to graduate school at Northwestern University outside of Chicago and became a journalist. Stayed in the city of Chicago and reported there for some 7 years, and reporting on issues of race and poverty in the city mostly. And then I moved to Washington, D.C., and I began to report on special interest money on the Hill for another investigative reporting group. Did that for 2 years, and then won a fellowship to report on the emerging Latino community in the rural South in poultry processing towns. This was 1999. This is a very long time ago. And I was interested in that story because these communities were all changing. They were becoming more and more Latino, Latinx. And I wanted to document and to write about that phenomenon. I wanted to find out how those communities were going to adjust to migration and changing demographics. And I wanted to also tell the stories of Latinos as they moved here and settled down here and began to integrate in the community. And that's what I did. The culmination of that work is my book, A Home on the Field, which tells the story of Siler City, North Carolina, a poultry processing town, through the lives and experiences of an all Latino high school soccer team that goes on to win a state championship, the first Latino high school team in the state to do so, and maybe even in the South, I think. I coached that team. I still coach Los Jets in Siler City. We had a game last night, and which we won.
Hey.
We won 4-1.
Woo.
We could have put 5 on them because we had a PK, but our player missed it. Anyway, and I'm also the one of the founders of the Scholars Latino Initiative, which of course has now become Latinx ED, and one of the founders of the Carolina Latinx Center, and also the Latina Caucus at UNC, and a bunch of other things on campus that I've done for student life and for Latinos here in Carolina. And that's it.
Paul.
That's
So hearing more about that as we go. Of course, Paul's work and the work that I do in the community is very much connected to the topic that we have for today, which is Nuestra Historia, our history here in the state. So also, like we mentioned a lot of facts about ourselves. Give a shout out in the comments if there's anything you have in common. Maybe it's Mexico, Morelia, Michoacan, right here, Peru, right, UNC, University of Michigan, anything you have in common, right? We want to build community as we go as well. So we want to see those comments come through. So before we move on, just to give you an overview, maybe this is your first time joining us, maybe you've been here before, but I'm representing Latinx Ed, which is a nonprofit organization, which is the organization hosting this cafecito, this Facebook Live. And we are dedicated to investing in Latinx students, educators, and families to expand educational equity and opportunity in North Carolina. We manifest this mission through our work with multiple initiatives, and we center positive racial ethnic development, identity development, and college access for Latinx youth, while also working with adults to create inclusive learning environments for our youth. I specifically manage the Somos Carolina Program, which is our identity and leadership development program for Latinx youth. We work in Orange County and Lee County. We have 4 high school chapters. So shout out to any of our scholars or family members that might be joining us today. And that's our organization. So if you feel compelled or you feel called to donate, there is a donate button right now. Feel free to invest in our organization as we invest in our community as well. But yeah, I did want to get us started. I know, Paul, you talked about your work with Siler City and writing this book about the transformation of some communities that transformation is still happening now. But I think our topic at hand, history, our history here in North Carolina, from your own perspective, are there any milestones that you can share with us about North Carolina's history, and maybe that the ones that have had a lot of impact in our community?
Sure. I think, we need to go all the way back. I mean, there's Latino history here, of course. There's Spanish history here, of course. And there's language history here in the Carolinas. And I think this is something that we need to recognize and acknowledge and embrace our understanding of our history. And of course, that includes our colonial history. So I'm going to go back hundreds of years to the Spanish who arrived in the Americas, specifically in Florida and in the Carolinas, and then began to explore and to develop forts, which they did. And so one of the very first European settlements is here in the Carolinas. It's actually out west. And it was a fort that was created and that's now being excavated archaeologically, and information is being gathered about that original presence. And what you see when you go back and you look at Spanish history is that you will see the Spaniards came and began to establish forts through the Carolinas, I think up into Tennessee as well. before those forts were eventually subsumed either by the indigenous population or by the English once they began to colonize North America. I think that's important to understand, if only for the fact that Spanish was the first European language spoken here. I mean, not only in what we consider Latin America, but also North America and the United States, what eventually becomes the United States. So, Florida, for instance, was a Spanish territory for a very long time until the United States took it over. So, we kind of need to acknowledge that, I think, because I think that we think of our history as simply the Southwest or the West, and don't really understand that part of our history also ties us to the Southeast. And
Mhm.
I just put that out there. It's not Latin American history or Latino history. It is a part of ourselves that we still have in us. And there's all kinds of literature and academic examination of colonialism and colonial Spain's rule in Latin America and what's that done, and our own issues with identity with
Mm.
regard to that, and our own kind of like how we deal with that. So I'm not getting involved in those discussions. I'm merely pointing out for our audience and our students that we had a hand, or you know part of our story is also here in the East, in the Southeast,
Mhm.
very specifically.
Yeah.
So beginning there, and then of course over time, the migration of people from south of the border into the Southeast, into the American South, to work in agriculture, and then eventually to work in other types of agriculture beginning in the early 1990s. And that's where I kind of like, really kind of focus in on.
Mhm.
And the food processing industry, the meat packing industry, the poultry processing industry, the hog processing industry, as being catalysts and triggers for migration for people to come and settle into the Southeast. And that's what people have done.
Yeah.
You look at a community like Siler City that was 1% Latino in 1990, and today is a majority Latino community. It's over 50%.
Yeah.
And that's really the story in a lot of these communities. Your community too.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you mentioned all of these industries that kind of attracted workers and immigrant families, and that's very much the story of my family. We came in 1999 from Mexico. We moved to Eastern North Carolina, and we moved there because we had relatives who were already working in a pork processing plant. Um, so that, I mean, that very much ties into the experiences of so many of our students, of so many people who might be listening right now, right? The reasons and like the motivations to try to come to North Carolina. A lot of them were economic. And for my family, that was a huge reason. Not only were we fleeing sort of like instability and the lack of safety in Morelia where we lived, but we wanted new economic opportunities, and my parents specifically wanted an education for us. And so the way for them, I think, in their minds, for them to do that was to come and find a job in whatever my mom's cousins were working in. And because like it was a good paying job back then. But yeah, I think when you were mentioning that, I was like, that very much like connects to like my own experience, right? And all the
Mhm.
students that you work and coach with and coach, right? Like their families, I think their backgrounds are very much connected to that history in North Carolina. And also like what you were saying in the beginning, it made me think about the fact that like language specifically, in the US, there's like people associate language with Latinos, like Spanish language with Latinos, and there's like a lot of pushback against like dual language education, or like only teaching English, or like making English the official language of the United States. But like Mexico, I think is like the most Spanish speaking country in the world, and I think the US is number 2 in terms of Spanish
Spanish, yeah.
speakers.
Mhm.
And it's certainly Spanish is the second most spoken language in the US. And people don't know this history, they don't acknowledge it. If they know it, they don't realize it. Some people don't want to know it, but like, yeah, Spanish is associated with the Latino community, but it has had a presence here even before this idea of Latinos, or this idea of the Latin America region was even a thing. It's like the presence of it has always been here, even before English.
Right. I mean, this is part of the erasure that's happened of various cultures and European cultures that have that were settling or conquering the Americas during that time. So the idea that North America or what contains the original 13 colonies from the British actually had Spanish presence initially, and that
Mm,
they were driven out or that they didn't succeed. The Spanish had a very different motivation. They sought conquest, they sought gold, they sought riches, and the British had a more colonial crop development, economic development, and settling than the Spaniards did at that time. But I think it's important that um, the totality of our history is told here in North America or in the United States, and that's certainly a part of it. And you don't get that a lot in this region. You get it a lot in the Southwest, of course, because
mhm,
it's undeniable because a good part of the United States was a part of Mexico.
mhm.
So, but you don't get that sense here in the Southeast, and so that's just a little bit of an acknowledgement. And of course, we're coming out of the Trump years and the whole sort of emboldenedness of people to be able to say things like, speak English only, why are you speaking that language? Well, it's natural to speak that language. It's natural to speak Spanish here because it's always been here from the very,
Yeah,
very beginning. So,
yeah. I mean, I think about my students and I think about myself growing up and like not knowing this and feeling like as an immigrant child, feeling so disconnected from this land and feeling alienated and kind of like pushed out. And because of that, having to hide like parts of who I was, or like being ashamed of speaking Spanish in public, or being or just feeling, yeah, like a sense of like disconnect from this region of the United States. And I don't know, I feel like as students, like growing up, if we learn this, if we connect to that history, if we understand it, um, it just makes you feel more connected, and your presence feels more in touch with the history of this region of the world. And like maybe like the highest numbers of people have arrived recently, but our presence has always played a role in this region of the United States,
yeah,
not just Southwest, right?
yeah, absolutely. So, um, there's a very fascinating story in Montana that happened during the Trump years. There's a couple, um, mother daughter. They were speaking Spanish at some gas station, some convenience store, and there's a border patrol agent who overheard them, and he decided to intervene and ask them questions about their citizenship status. They're originally from Puerto Rico, so they're U.S. citizens. And uh, did he detain them? I don't think he detained them, but they complained to Homeland Security about the intrusion and being asked questions. And the whole idea that if you speak Spanish, you are automatically sort of delegitimized,
Mm-hmm.
by certain people. When speaking Spanish here is the most natural thing in the world. I mean, it's but people have that attitude that uh, it's English only all the time, every time, going all the way back hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what's of course, the most ironic thing about that story about the couple is that um, they were this happened in Montana, and the very origin of the word Montana for the state of Montana is a Spanish word, which is
Mm-hmm.
montaña.
Montaña, yeah.
It was once part of Mexico.
Yeah.
So here you had this officer questioning these people for speaking Spanish in a state that's derived from a Spanish word. Yeah, it's just crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that like attack on people and invalidating like their presence here simply for speaking Spanish is unfortunately like an experience that a lot of us have growing up. Like I see stories all the time, or like videos that people capture like racist attacks, and like they'll bring up like language or like the way you look or the way you sound, maybe you have an accent. And like it's just this lack of acknowledgement, this lack of willing to recognize, and specifically with like Spanish, like the presence of it, but also like the people have, we're not just like, we didn't just pop out of nowhere one day, right? Like we've been here for several generations now.
Mhm. Right. And then going back to like your own experience, Jose, with the food processing industry,
Mm.
when I talk about this and when I write about this in A Home on the Field or in the television series Los Jets, um, this is not an accident. I think a lot of people think that the migration of people in the past 20, 30 years, that people in Mexico or Central America all of a sudden decided one day that they would move to the United States on a whim. Of
Mhm.
course, that's not true. People are pushed out of their countries for economic reasons that have their origin here in the United States.
Mhm.
And so those are the pressure points that can compel people to move from like Mexico. And that happened in the 90s, of course, with the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement, in which the United States dumped cheap subsidized corn on the Mexican market and
Mhm.
devastated thousands of Mexican farmers who then had to abandon their family farm, go to the central cities in Mexico, and then from there come to the United States and work in sometimes the very companies that put them out of business
Yeah.
in Mexico. And people don't understand that sort of dynamic. They think that people just sort of came here out of, I don't know, an idea, a whim, something capricious. But no, people come or have come because there are these economic forces at play, very strong global forces at play that have forced essentially poor people to migrate and then to come and to work cheap jobs in the agricultural industry here in the U.S. And then these communities begin to change, and the long-term residents don't understand the globalization factors that are compelling people to move into their small little towns.
Mhm.
The longtime residents of these towns like Siler City and Sanford, Lee County, all these longstanding communities don't understand why this happened to them,
Mhm.
and it's created confusion, and then from that confusion, anger, and it's that anger that unscrupulous politicians have used to get themselves elected and to use, to have these crazy, campaigns, policies of building walls and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah. I think my grandfather in Mexico, he was an ejeditario. So it's like I don't understand it completely, but it's like a communal farm and everyone has like their own plot of land. And this was after the Mexican Revolution, after like 1810. And so I remember my mom has told me she grew up on the farm. She was a teenager in the 80s when they moved to Mexico. But I do know that over the years, my grandfather had just stopped growing corn because it wasn't profitable. And so he still owns that plot of land, but like there's no like profit that comes with that. Like he just stopped farming completely after the 90s because there was no point in it. And so they moved just to the city in Morelia, and now they live there. They have this farm, this land. They just kind of like have cows and other animals, but in terms of crops and profitability of those crops, like it's not worth it anymore to them. And so yeah, my in terms of my dad, I think he grew up in the city, but we were just at a point where we just needed this opportunity. And then like my mom's cousins had been coming and going and working in pork processing plants. And so that's when we were like, well, like that seems like a good option for us. And it was for like a year, and then it just kind of like I don't know what happened to the pork processing plant. I think the owner or something went bankrupt or something. So my dad had to find a new job. And so in that part of the state, we didn't have as many like polleras or like poultry plants. And so he just kind of like had to find whatever job was available. But what I've noticed specifically like in Kinston, North Carolina, is the emergence of I think it's Smithfield,
Hmm.
the company. There are I think there's like two or three plants, and I think it started when I was in high school, so like around 10 years ago, and now it's like I think there's like 2 more being constructed, and so it's just been growing. And so many of my like mom's friends and relatives also work in like the, I forgot the company's names, but like pork and turkeys and chicken processing plants. And so I've seen it in my community, and I've seen especially like during COVID in some of these plants the effect that it had, because some of these companies, some of these places became super spreaders because they were not allowing their people to have guidelines in place that they should have to prevent the spread of COVID. And even before that, just so many um, stories of like inhumane treatment, basically. Like some of these people having to wear like adult diapers because they're not like allowed restroom breaks when they need them. Um, like overworking, and just like the work environment is horrible. It's demeaning. It's the inhumane in so many of these places. And people just do not realize that they exist. Like these places exist where like these working conditions are real and they're impacting lives.
Yeah,
Unfortunately.
absolutely. So, I mean, you're describing the classic pathway of migration in the 90s from Mexico. So, the North American Free Trade Agreement allowed the United States to dump cheap corn. And our corn and many of our crops are subsidized by the American taxpayer. They're
Mm,
subsidized to keep our farmers profitable and essentially funded. If we were to let the market set prices for crops here in the United States, many farmers might go out of business. But we control that, and so we subsidize with our tax dollars to ensure that that there's profitability for them. But it makes the product incredibly cheap. So,
mm,
and they grow a ton of it for that reason. And so now you have these U.S. growers who are growing corn, and Mexico is now an open market, and they can undercut the prices of anybody growing corn in Mexico. And of course, people in Mexico call themselves the children of the corn.
mhm.
You can't eat in Mexico without tortillas, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's how people eat. So their market was undercut and destroyed by that free trade agreement, and lots of American businesses made a ton of money off it.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, for subsistence farmers like your family, it was no longer profitable to grow corn on their little plot of land, which is incredibly crazy
Yeah.
because this is where corn originates, right? The Mexican people, the Mexica people, cultivate, from little seeds, what we call corn today. I mean, it doesn't look. I mean, if you go back hundreds of years, to pre-Columbian civilizations in Mexico, their corn does not look like our corn. I mean,
Not at all.
it had to be developed over generations and cultivated and experimented with. So now, I mean, you have the origin of a subsistence crop like corn, which has fed the world, right? Um, in a place where people can't grow it anymore. I mean, it's crazy. So
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons why people came here. It's
Mm.
important for us to understand that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for that background. I think it's so important to understand, um, especially to gain a perspective of what is happening in the present day. But I wanted to also discuss maybe important leaders or movements, organizations that you know of that have played a key role in helping to advance educational equity, specifically educational equity in the state of North Carolina. I know as an undocumented student growing up, I was always worried about college. I was always worried about my possibilities for what I wanted to be successful in after college. And so I think that's when I sort of started gaining some sense of some of the barrier, like legal barriers or other situations that limited students' access, but not just undocumented students, right? Like there's so many policies that impact Latinx students in the state. And I know things have changed over time, but there's still lots of room for improvement and for growth and for advancing educational equity. But yeah, any leaders or organizations that you know of?
The North Carolina Society of Professionals is one. I mean, they've hosted a convention on behalf of education almost every year, and the Tomorrow Fund, was also another big one of the early organizations that provided scholarship funding for students who didn't have papers.
Mm,
Um, uh, you know, at around the time that I got here, these types of organizations were just beginning to be formed or were just in the early stages of their development. So, like El Pueblo in Raleigh and El Centro in Durham, that's the beginning part of their phase, and they come to life because of the need,
yeah.
the overwhelming need from the community for something like this, whether it's workers' rights or whether it's on education. They help to fill in whatever gaps and provide education for the longstanding community to understand, this community and these students. And then, of course, like the Scholars Latino Initiative at Carolina, which helped fund, but also helped to mentor hundreds and hundreds of students in 4 different counties: Lee, Chatham, Randolph. Um, I think Durham was a part of it at one
Sure,
point.
yeah.
And that, of course, has morphed into Latinx AD. So all these things, I like to say, all these institutions had to be sort of created or incubated because they didn't exist before.
Mhm,
So, and we're still doing that. We're still doing that kind of spade work where we have to build things for our community. So
mhm,
we need to build these institutions to be able to help ourselves. And then, of course, DACA really helps to change things. But it's an imperfect um, program, but at least a program where there's been longstanding um, ossification of immigration reform.
mhm,
So from Congress and from the executives. So I mean, what could we do? We couldn't. No one could pass immigration reform. George Bush couldn't do it. Barack Obama didn't do it. Donald Trump, of course, did not do it. So for the past more than 2 decades, there's been this cry to kind of reform the system in some way or another, and it's still doubtful whether President Biden will be able to do the same. So it's an imperfect program, but it's helped so many people.
yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm definitely a beneficiary of that program. And it's interesting you mentioned El Pueblo because I think that was one of the first organizations that when we came, we heard about. I think like I think they were in Durham, or not Durham, Raleigh, and I think they still are. But they would host La Fiesta del Pueblo, which is a huge, huge festival in Raleigh. And when I was growing up, my parents put me in a dance troupe of ballet folklorico at my church. And so we ended up going to dance for El Pueblo, I think several years when I was in high school, my sister as well. And then I think they were hosting a Latino Youth Forum, I think. And so I got involved with El Pueblo. Um, and I was just so excited to like have this opportunity to join a youth committee that was like running a conference for Latinx youth in the state. And I was like learning about leadership, and I was learning about like this entire group and movement of people like advancing equity in the state. And so I was just mind blown, like as a high school student, being from Snow Hill, North Carolina, where there was nothing anywhere near it. Like what? And so it was actually pretty far from my house. It was because I'm from Snow Hill. That's like from Raleigh, it's like an hour and 15 minutes. But my mom would drive me like every other week just so I could participate in this program. And so, yeah, like El Pueblo has a special place in my heart. Shout out to El Pueblo. I'm still in touch with some of them, and I follow them and see all their updates. So now I feel very excited to be back in North Carolina after 3 years in Texas, where Texas has its own like unique community, unique movements, but kind of like seeing how things are in Texas now and kind of like comparing it in a way, but not like just to like see where we're at now and some of the advancements that have happened in Texas. And of course, both places still need movement, transformation, change for equity. But I'm very excited to see where our state is now going. And being part of Latinx, of course, is awesome for me to have this opportunity. So yeah. Just wanted to say shout out to El Pueblo.
They used to do something else called El Foro Latino.
I heard about it, but I
It,
don't think
it
I
was
ever.
a convention. It was a gathering of all the Latino advocacy groups in the state, big, small. I mean, we didn't understand how many little organizations and people that were out there that were trying to help the community.
Hmm.
So the photo was a place for everybody to sort of come, share information, get to know each other, and then promote their own organization. So then you get like organizations like El Centro, and you get organizations like El Vínculo Hispano, and all these other little advocacy groups from all over the state in these small little towns would come and they would share ideas and they'd have these plenary sessions and share information and do a lot of open source kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. And I also, when you said Society of Hispanic Professionals, I remember going to that
Yeah,
educational summit they hosted like every year.
it's
I
huge.
went like four years in a row
Yeah,
when I was in high school. And like in North Carolina, again, like in North Carolina, Eastern North Carolina, I feel like there's not much happening. And so like they would bus as many students as they could to Raleigh from Snow Hill,
yeah,
because like the educational fairs, like all the colleges represented. I would always go to talk to UNC and like, that was just something I was craving and I didn't have access to in Snow Hill, or like even in Greenville, North Carolina, which was the nearest city to Snow Hill.
yeah. When we're talking about history, we're talking about these organizations. We're talking about people. Among the advocates and the people that were helping the community. I mean, there are names that I know some graduate student in the future or some PhD student is going to start doing biographies on,
Hmm.
because they helped to found these organizations or they helped to do these type of things at the time of the migration. So, people like Marco Sarate from the Society of Hispanic Professionals, people like Andrea Basan from El Pueblo, people like Juvencio Peralta from Amexica in
Mm,
Eastern North Carolina, and Alana Dubester in Siler City from El Vínculo Hispano. I mean, those are real historic people. I mean, they're still among us, so you don't think of
yeah,
them as historic figures. But you go forward 80 years from now, 100 years from now, when people are starting to put together the story of Latinos in the Southeast, those are going to be very prominent names of people that helped or were there during the migration. And the migration is this period now. I mean, you're part of the great migration of Latinos to the United States at the turn of the century.
yeah.
So very, very much like the Irish at the turn of the 20th century, or the Italians or the Jews who came from Europe at the turn of the 20th century. We saw Latinos, Mexicans, Central Americans, and others come to the United States at the turn of the 21st century.
Yeah. Yeah, something else that I thought about, we were talking about DACA and the fight for immigration reform and how it just has failed at the federal level. But do you recall any like either like good or bad developments in regards to immigration here in the state after the wave of immigrants came to North Carolina?
No, it's been a story of conflict. It's been a tug of war. So certainly not since the Republicans took over the state house in 2010. I
Mhm.
mean, a couple of bills were just passed last week seeking, well, they were not passed, but a couple of bills were introduced. Let me correct that. Just last week that were seeking to limit immigrants in some way,
Mhm.
access to services or whatever. Um, and um, uh, the story of the school system is exactly like this. North Carolina still doesn't allow for in-state tuition for
Yeah.
students who graduate from its high schools who are undocumented or unauthorized.
Mhm.
You know, that hasn't been fixed. Um, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of movement on it. And then maybe 10 years ago, there was this whole back and forth at the community college level for in-state tuition. force students to go to community college level who are undocumented.
Mm,
So it's been like back and forth, a real tug of war, and it sort of has settled on less access now. And of course, that's because the state house changed historically in 2010.
hmm. I remember with driver's license specifically,
Yeah,
for undocumented people, like when we came, my parents were able to get their driver's license, and then I think they passed a bill that changed that and denied driver's licenses unless you had like a social security number. And so when it came time, my parents were not able to renew their driver's licenses. So that was something I was thinking about too. And that there's been this movement, I know at like the General Assembly to try to get undocumented immigrants driver's licenses, because other states have done it. I think New York recently did it, maybe. I'm not sure, but it's this idea, right? Like you said, tug of war of like wanting to push back against the immigrant community, or like trying to make it harder to gain access to resources, to gain access to education, to gain access to like something as simple as a driver's license, which like in my mind is, why should you deny something that makes driving safer for everyone to an entire group of people, thousands and thousands of people that are driving, and then I mean they're still driving because they have to go to work, they have children, and so I don't know, you're just limiting that access to these things and basically like creating more oppression for them.
right. I mean, it's not logical in my mind. On the other side, um, they would argue that the driver's license is a form of government ID, and we use it to travel. Since 9/11, it's used to identify you for boarding an airplane. Now we have real ID to further do that, to prevent terrorist actions. All this kind of stuff. People have argued on behalf of why people without papers should not have a driver's license. I remember uh, when DACA recipients could access a driver's license, and the initial response was to paint it a different color.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, so that it could be easily identifiable. And then that was struck down because it was too stigmatizing and it reminded people of various bad history in other
Mm,
parts of the world. And so they decided to make the driver's license a vertical driver's license, the way that you give teenagers. They have their driver's is not horizontal, it's vertical. And so that was then the signifying marker for DACA recipients to get their
yeah.
driver's license. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think they changed it later because now you get your regular one, but it doesn't have anything major like that's popping out. It just has letters. It says, let me see, 'cause I have mine right here.
There you go. See?
It says legal presence, no slash no lawful status in red letters in the middle of like under my address.
Yeah.
So everything looks normal, like the same, except for that part. So like there's still like an effort, right, to differentiate it and create this like signifying mark of like, oh, like you are not regular, you're an alien, you're someone
Yeah.
who's not from here.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. In terms of like state tuition, I remember I did an internship at with SAF, Student Action with Farm Workers. Shout out to SAF as well. And I was the lobbying intern at the General Assembly, and this was, what year was this? 2015, maybe 2015, I think. So like 5, 6 years ago. And the big issue that I was like focused on learning about and trying to connect legislators with was in-state tuition for undocumented students. But I do remember in high school, like the debate that you mentioned about the community college, because we had actually, I think it was Juvencio. I actually know Juvencio. He's
He's
not
great.
related. He's related to people that are related to me.
Oh, really?
It's
I met him like in 1999.
wow, you go way, way back. Yeah, I mean, that's when we met him too, when we arrived. Because, okay, so he's related to me because his sister is married to my mom's cousin, and
Oh,
there
really?
are names. So I grew up knowing Juvencio. Shout out to Juvencio as well. And
That's
I'm excited.
yeah, I met him because when I got here, I was reporting, and I was reporting on the food processing industry. So I went to hog country. I went to turkey country. There's a huge turkey processing plant called Carolina Turkeys, and he used to work at that plant. And
Oh,
yeah, and so his organization springs from that area, and
mhm.
he and I
Yeah. I remember
became
him coming in and sort of giving information about what was happening with community colleges. Because I think initially there was a point where like no one could attend if you were undocumented, and then they like reversed that decision soon afterwards because it was like unconstitutional, maybe. I'm not sure. And so he came to explain what was happening and that students could still go to college. They would just have to pay out of state tuition, even if it was at the community level. And so I remember thinking about that and I was like, I want to go to UNC. Like, what's going to happen? I'm not going to be able to pay. My parents can't afford it. Like, if I don't have a scholarship, I'm not going to be able to go to college. And so that was just crazy for me to think about because my plan B and my parents and I had talked about this was you can go to Mexico. You just have to get an education over there.
right. Yeah.
And luckily, thankfully, Golden Door Scholars was founded when I was a senior in high school, and uh, thankfully, I was part of that first cohort of scholars that were sent to college with full rides, undocumented students. And then I had this opportunity working with staff of learning about this movement. And I don't know, do you know much about Adelante Coalition?
Yes. Well, you're really taxing my memory with all this. But that's another one of these organizations. One of these.
Yeah, because that's what I was thinking about. I don't know how far back they go, but I was part of the Adelante Coalition while I was an intern. And so like all of these organizations you were mentioning, and some from Charlotte as well, like we came and we hosted an undocumented graduation. And if I remember correctly, undocumented graduation goes back like many years. And it's so for those of you that are watching us right now, undocumented graduation is an event put on by undocumented students and allies at the General Assembly, where people who are undocumented, who are either still in high school or who have graduated high school, share their experiences and they lobby for in-state tuition in the state because, like Paul was saying, if you're undocumented, you can attend college, but you can't pay in-state tuition, even if you've lived here all your life. So that event, I think, just remind me of Adelante and all of these organizations you were mentioning, and the push, right, for equity, that still needs to happen, right? That there are still so many students mobilizing across the state to try to get something passed in the state here.
Right. Yeah. If there's some smart student, is is thinking of their dissertation for their PhD in history, all these names and organizations, like we're trying to kind of like remember these things, but they're all part of history,
Yeah.
and they're going to be a part of significant history because the migration and the continuing growth of the community. We're at 10% of the population now, 1/10 of the population, and 18% nationally, on our way to 20%. A fifth of the population will identify as Latino.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, this is the time to kind of begin to gather these stories, before they're forgotten.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. And I think it's happening in some places, but I think it's sort of scattered across like different parts or like maybe like certain centers at colleges. I know like at UNC, the Latino Migration Project with Dr. Hannah Gill. I took her class and that was part of our work,
Yeah,
um, collecting stories of not only like leaders, community organizers, but also like the people and their stories and their experiences of
right.
being here in the state.
I mean, that was the purpose of A Home in the Field, was
Yeah.
to tell this story now and collect these stories for eventually tomorrow. And you may not know this, but I also have a photography collection at the Wilson Library at UNC, and it's my photography from, I don't know, 1999 to about 2004, something like that, 2005, really documenting the migration here.
Yeah. Can you talk more a little bit about the book, like maybe some of the major themes that you discuss in the book, and how they connect to our topic with history, Latinx
Right.
community in the state?
Well, definitely what we've been talking about in terms of those push elements that push people out of their country and the pull elements that attract people to the United States, namely jobs and namely the food processing industry. And then really it's the book examines, you know, a town that has never seen any immigration before. And then how does that town cope with that? And at the same time, you know, how do the newcomers find and create a home for themselves in that community?
Yeah.
You know, it's telling those stories at the same time. But mostly it tells it all through the lives and experiences of Latino boys who have come over here because their dads and mothers are working in the poultry processing industry.
Yeah. And I think sort of wrapping up now, some of these resources like Paul's book, if you're out here and you want to learn more about, you want to educate yourself about the Latinx history in the state, Paul's book is a great resource. But do you have any other resources, Paul, or
Yeah,
any recommendations for how to get involved and learn? You know, there's so much we don't know, and there's so much we're not taught in school. And I certainly have been on this journey of self-educating myself
yeah.
about my.
You know, you can look up the documentary television series Los Jets. You can stream it now on tubitv.com. That's tubitv.com. And you just look up Los Jets and you'll see all 6 episodes. And that's a fantastic documentary because you hear from the kids themselves, kids who were born in Mexico or in Central America, and kids who were born here, second generation, in the United States from the diaspora, from the migration.
Yeah.
So, and you know, I really love that series because we you know, there are little examples, very few examples where we actually hear from Latino young men and the things that you know their lives, their hopes and dreams, and what they want to do with their lives. So, and you get to see that, you get to see their lives. So,
Yeah, I don't know if you remember, but I was in that documentary. I have like a few seconds where
yeah, I remember
I'm presenting about the Golden
you're
Rush.
talking to the class.
Yeah, I went to one of the class back when Sly was working with students in Iowa City. And I have like a few seconds in there, but I'm in there.
Right, I remember you.
Yeah. All right. So I don't know if the audience has any questions. We have some time now. If there's any questions that you might have, feel free to ask in the comment section. We are keeping up with it, so we can answer maybe some of your questions. But thank you for joining us. I certainly learned a lot, and it's always great to kind of like see the big picture, but also get into the details and those stories with those people. And so continue to learn and educate ourselves. I think it's so important, especially in my case, like working with Latinx youth and like working with identity development. It's so important, not just for myself as an educator, but also like for them to learn about these stories and understand the complexity of our histories and how they're connected to the U.S. South. Because, like I've said, like we didn't just appear out of nowhere one day, right? There were so many factors that contributed to our coming here and our own development as a community here in the state. Um, so yeah, I don't know if you have any closing thoughts or comments, Paul.
No, I mean, it's been a wonderful program. Little cafecito. I had water.
Thanks.
But I hope the audience considers some of the things that we've spoken about today and about how many of us, I mean, we're living this history right now. And like I said, you know, this is, there are parallels to other migrations from other people to the United States. And our story is going to be told.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm looking forward to that day when I open up a book and hear all these amazing people, organizations, and communities that mobilize and help transform our state into a better future.
Definitely.
All right. Well, that is it from us. Again, if you want to keep up with the cafecitos, we will be having 5 more. You can go to our website, latinxed.org, and click on the events tab, I believe. Um, oh, and then we do have a question. Paul, are you writing a new book? If so, would you mind telling us about it?
Yeah, I'm working on a companion piece to A Home in the Field. It's been a little under 20 years. So, really see, I think with another chapter in this story, we can really see the evolution of the community. We just elected our first Latino representative from Chatham County. I'm not
Mhm.
talking about Ricky Hurtado, that guy up in Alamance. I don't know about him.
Follow.
But Franklin Gomez Flores is a county commissioner. He's from Siler City, grew up in Siler City. I coached him for the Jets, and he's a
Right.
graduate of UNC. He's a Sly kid as well, and he's now representing us on the county board of commissioners. And so, we're seeing, the evolution of the community itself. And it's one of the things that we were really interested in at Sly. We were educating people and we were mentoring people and we were helping to fund people onto college, but we needed to complete the circle and develop leadership, and that's been the evolution of Latinx ED, is to develop that leadership. So
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. We'll be looking forward to that. And then there's another question.
you should
About,
invite him on this.
we should.
Yeah, invite Franklin. Absolutely.
That would be a great idea. I think that would be great, like getting people's experiences um, of how like their educational journey kind of like led them to where they're at now, and like specifically in his role and the significance of it. Like he's from Siler City, and now he is a leader in the local government. That would be awesome.
Well, there's one last thing here. If you want to see my
Yeah.
photographic work, which is open source, so if you want to use it, you can use it. You go to the Wilson Library, or you can just Google Wilson Library, Paul Cuadros photographs, uh, collection. That's it. Paul Cuadros photography collection, Wilson Library, UNC.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you for joining us, Paul.
All right.
I've enjoyed this, learning more about Latinx history in North Carolina. And for our audience, again, we look forward to hearing from you in the comments in our future cafecitos. Have a great one.
Bye bye.